Welcome in. Take a breath. If you're watching this at night, go ahead. Dim the lights. Turn on a fan if it helps. Let the shadows move a little. This is the kind of story that breathes better in the quiet. If you're joining us from somewhere across the world, let me know where you're watching from. There's something comforting about knowing someone else is out there in the dark too. Tonight, we're stepping into a world long buried beneath cobblestones and silence. A world not of kings and knights, but of stench and filth, of whispered prayers and chamber pots. This isn't the medieval history you grew up hearing. This is the one that was conveniently left out. So lean in close. And whatever you do, don't breathe too deep. Imagine walking barefoot down a narrow alleyway in the heart of a medieval town. The sky above is a dull smear of gray, the kind of overcast that feels heavy on your chest, like the clouds know something you don't. The walls rise around you, stone, timber, and the aching sigh of old wood. They're leaning in just a little too close, like they're listening. And then the smell hits you. There's no getting used to it. It's not just one smell. It's 1,000. Rot, urine, feces, wet hay, meat gone sour, smoke, sweat, and something you can't quite place. Something metallic maybe, or moldy, like time itself is decaying. You try not to gag, but your stomach rolls anyway. You keep walking. Beneath your feet, the road isn't a road at all. It's a stream. A thin brown ribbon winding through the street, carrying everything that isn't wanted. Human waste, animal droppings, spilled ale, dead rats, blood from the butcher's stall. It trickles sluggishly through the town like the heartbeat of something sick and forgotten. This is not an accident. This is how cities worked. Streets were their sewers. There were no underground pipes, no clean water flowing silently beneath the feet of kings and peasants alike. Water came from wells or public fountains, if you were lucky. And waste? Waste found its own way out. But sometimes, that wasn't enough. If you lived near a river, congratulations. Your waste might actually go somewhere. The Thames, the Seine, the Tiber, they were all beautiful from a distance and deadly up close. People washed their clothes in them. They bathed, they drank, and they dumped into them. Everything. Night soil, collected in buckets under beds, was hurled from windows with a shout. Gardez l'eau! Look out for the water. But not everyone shouted, and not everyone cared. Now imagine this. You're a visitor, a stranger in a strange land. Maybe you've come from the countryside where the air is fresh and the streams run clear. You step into the city, boots new and polished. Within moments they're ruined, caked with filth, the leather soaked through with muck you can't name. You dodge a horse cart, only to find yourself splashed by a falling bucket from above. You want to curse, but no one else seems to mind, because here this is normal. Public latrines existed, of course, usually near the market square or by the river. Big stone structures, sometimes with several seats in a row, built over running water, if the town was advanced enough to divert a stream. You didn't go there for privacy. You went because you had to. You might sit next to a monk, a baker, a prostitute, a priest. No stalls, no walls, just stone benches with holes and the sound of whatever flowed beneath you. The conversations were strange, quiet, awkward, eyes fixed forward, mouths moving slowly, like the words themselves might catch on the stink. Some latrines were more elaborate. In London, the famed House of Easement sat above the River Fleet, a multi-seat facility built in the 14th century. It was supposed to be a marvel of urban planning, but even it couldn't stop the river from turning black with waste. People joked that the fleet flowed backwards from the sheer force of filth being poured into it. And when latrines weren't available or too far to reach, well, you did what everyone else did. You found a corner, behind a tavern, near the church wall, down an alley, wherever you could squat quickly and quietly before someone caught you, because even though no one really enforced it, it was still technically illegal and dangerous. The spread of disease, the stench, the flies, people knew. They just didn't have a choice. Wiping was another matter entirely. Toilet paper as we know it simply didn't exist. Paper was expensive. Even parchment, made from animal skin, was precious. You used what you had. Straw, if it was dry, leaves, rags, a handful of moss, sometimes a piece of old cloth if you were lucky. In winter, maybe nothing. Maybe just your hand, wiped clean in the grass, or not at all. And yet life went on. Children played in those streets. Lovers whispered in alleys lined with chamber pots and rats. Market stalls spilled over with meat, bread, fish, and right beside them, gutters oozing with waste. Bakers kneaded dough with hands stained from who knows what. Butchers rinsed blood down the drain, watched it mix with sewage, and went back to their knives. And through it all, there was an unspoken understanding. This is how things are. Not because people were stupid, but because the tools didn't exist, because centuries of civilization had passed, and still, no one had figured out what to do with the waste of an entire town. There was no bleach, no hand sanitizer, no flush, no clean break between filth and food, between sickness and the sacred. It was all mashed together in a world that never stopped moving. And in that world, sickness was always nearby. It whispered from the corners of streets. It clung to doorknobs and lips and the folds of sleeves. Typhoid, cholera, dysentery. The words didn't mean much then, but the symptoms did. The sudden vomiting, the bloody stool, the fever that burned behind the eyes and hollowed out a body in days. When the plague came, and it always came, it wasn't some cosmic punishment. It was a consequence. A tide rolling in after years of rot, rats feasting on scraps, fleas biting skin, people dropping in the streets with blackened limbs and bursting sores. And still, the waste flowed. Downhill, always downhill, toward some river, some forgotten pit, some shallow grave dug in haste. No one thought it was beautiful, but no one could stop it. They just lived with it. Because what else could they do? That's where we begin. Not with kings and queens, but with the stream that ran through the heart of every medieval town. The one no one talked about, but everyone knew. And what came next would change everything. It's the gong farmer, a man whose job, if you can call it that, is to climb down into the cesspits of the city, to shovel out the filth, to heave the waste of thousands into wooden carts and wheel it outside the walls before sunrise. His hands are blistered, his boots are soaked, his breath is a mix of smoke and stomach acid and years of holding it all in. Nobody looks him in the eye, nobody thanks him, not really. But without him, the city would choke on its own waste. He carries a lantern. Its light is dim and flickers in the fog. He's heading toward a tenement block, where the pit beneath the shared latrine is full again. The smell hit him before he got within 50 feet. It's thick, sour, almost oily in the way it clings to the skin. He ties a cloth over his face. Not that it helps. He's been doing this too long. He can smell through cloth, through walls, through bone. And then, without a word, he opens the hatch and climbs down. Now you'd think this kind of thing might be a punishment, a sentence reserved for criminals. But no, this was a job, a paid one. Not well, of course, but better than starving, better than stealing. And it came with its own kind of twisted honor, because only a few were strong enough to do it, or stupid enough, or desperate enough. Down in the pit, time slows. You can't see much. Just the flicker of the lantern against the curved stone, the splash of something unspeakable, the quiet, wet sound of a shovel slicing into decades of decay. Everything echoes, even breathing. And as the farmer works, he sometimes hums to himself. Not a song, just a sound. Something to fill the space that silence refuses to touch. He fills the cart by the time the sky starts to brighten. And then he's off again, down the road, past the baker lighting his oven, past the church, where the bells are starting their lazy ring, past the children still too young to understand the weight of the world pressed into that cart. Outside the city gates, he finds a trench. It's long, deep, dug by others like him days before. This is where the waste goes. This is the city's stomach, turning itself inside out. Flies swarm before the first load hits the pit. The sun is just coming up, casting long shadows that stretch like claws across the ground. The farmer dumps the cart. wipes his forehead, lights a pipe. This is his morning, and tomorrow he'll do it all again. But not everyone used cesspits. Not everyone had that luxury. In many towns, homes were built without any kind of sanitation. The poorest of the poor lived crammed together in wooden huts. No drains, no access to latrines. They had buckets, or nothing at all. At night, the streets came alive with sound. Shutters creaked open. A hand reached out, casually tipping a chamber pot over the edge. Liquid slapped the stones below with a wet thud. Rats scattered. Dogs barked. And no one apologized, because this is just how it worked. There were attempts to fix it, of course. Laws passed, fines threatened. No throwing waste from windows. Keep the streets clean. Use the designated areas. But who would enforce it? The same men who wore silk gloves and drank from silver goblets. They didn't walk these alleys. They didn't smell what the poor smelled. They didn't live with the rot pressed into the walls of their homes. In some towns, people tried to pave the streets, add gutters, build proper drains, but the rain turned it all to soup anyway. And even the nicest neighborhoods couldn't stay clean for long. The wind carried the stench. The rot found a way in. And it wasn't just the cities. Rural life had its own kind of filth. In the countryside, peasants shared their cottages with pigs, goats, chickens. The floor was packed earth. The roof leaked. And when it was cold, you didn't go outside. You used a pot, a corner. You cleaned it when the smell became unbearable, or when someone got sick. Because illness wasn't just expected, it was constant. Children died. Women died. Men died. Diarrhea wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. Especially in winter, when water froze and rags ran out. One infection could wipe out an entire family. But it wasn't just the waste that killed. It was the way it was handled. The way hands touched everything, the bread, the child, the wound, without thinking. Because there was no alternative. And still the world turned. In monasteries, the monks tried to be better. They studied Roman sanitation, built rudimentary plumbing, ran water through stone channels. But even they couldn't escape the reality of it. One cracked pipe, one blocked trench, and their cloister was no different than the city streets. It's strange, isn't it, to think of civilization, cathedrals, courts, guilds, markets, all built on top of a foundation of filth, a 1,000-year dance with disease, with rot, with the human body at its most base. But this is the truth, the quiet, ugly truth beneath the romance of history. A truth no one carved into marble, no one sang about in the halls of kings. Yet here it is, whispering from the corners of every old town, every crooked alley, every cracked stone that once held up the weight of an entire city. And somewhere in the distance, a gong farmer lights his lantern and climbs back down into the dark. The sun has risen, and with it, the hum of the city thickens like a fog you can't shake. People shuffle into markets. Bakers yell across booths. Blacksmiths strike iron with a rhythm that echoes down the alleys like drums of a war no one ever declared. Life in a medieval town is not quiet. It's a constant thrum of survival. And underneath it all, always, the stench, the rot. A smell baked into the wood of every home, soaked into the soil, clinging to every breath like a ghost that won't leave. You wouldn't think something like waste could shape a civilization, but it did. It decided who lived and who died. It drew the line between rich and poor, not in wealth, but in disease. It lingered at the root of revolts, fires, laws. It sculpted the streets themselves. But what happens when you pretend not to smell it? That's what the aristocracy did. Behind castle walls, nobles built their own kind of filth. Not open streams, not crowded latrines, but stone towers with holes in the walls called garderobes. Fancy word, isn't it? French. It literally means to guard the robes, because in some strange twist of logic, nobles would hang their clothes in the shaft's draft, believing the ammonia in the waste would keep fleas away. Yes, they hung their cloaks over the toilet. These shafts often emptied into moats or cesspools below, and if you think that sounds bad, imagine being the servant who had to clean them. Because someone always had to. These weren't self-flushing marvels. These were holes in cold stone, where a mistake could mean a plunge into something far worse than water. Sometimes in castles under siege, the waste backed up. The pipes froze. The smell made rooms unlivable. Rats found their way in. And through it all, the nobles sat on their thrones, real and porcelain alike, pretending they weren't surrounded by rot. But the rot didn't care. It crept in anyway. In the summer heat, the stench became unbearable, even for the privileged. Lavender, vinegar, rosemary. They were used not to clean, but to mask. Nobles carried handkerchiefs soaked in perfume. They held them beneath their noses while walking through town, eyes forward, hearts distant. But they couldn't escape the water. Even the best homes had only so much access to clean sources. Wells near cesspits became contaminated. Streams that sparkled upstream ran brown by the time they reached the heart of the city. And rain didn't cleanse. It stirred everything back to the surface. There were attempts to organize, to clean. In the 14th century, King Edward III issued orders for the streets of London to be cleared of dung and garbage. But words on parchment don't move muck. Men do, and men with power didn't lift shovels. So it was left to the guilds, the apprentices, the forgotten laborers, boys no older than 12, men with missing teeth and skin that never stopped itching. They hauled buckets, scrubbed stone with ash, buried rot in shallow ditches, and prayed the rain would come soon to wash away the rest. But every time it rained, the filth rose again. Some towns tried to engineer solutions. Bruges, in Flanders, was famous for its system of canals. Picturesque, right? Tourists flock there now. But in its prime, those canals weren't for romance. They were the arteries of the town's waste. Sludge ran beneath bridges. Ships carried more than goods. And when the wind blew wrong, the scent could drop a grown man to his knees. And in Italy, in Venice, the jewel of the Adriatic, there was no place for pits. So they built over water, directly over it. Homes, shops, churches, all raised above canals that doubled as trash heaps and sewers. Gondolas floated past floating carcasses. Tourists might see beauty now, but back then, the air was heavy with salt, decay, and the sweet reek of decomposition. Disease followed like a shadow. You couldn't see it, not at first, but it crept in. Smallpox, typhus, plague. The Black Death came in 1347, and when it did, it didn't start with coughing. It started with a smell, a heaviness in the air, a silence in the streets, as if the rats knew before the people did. Fleas bit rats. Rats bit food. Food fed people. And within days, the city choked. Bodies lined the alleys. Carts rolled through town not for produce, but for the dead. No priests left to pray, no time for graves. Just pits. So many pits. And what do you think filled those pits? After, when the bodies were gone and the panic faded, when the world kept spinning as it always does, the same waste, the same rot, the same silence. Because for all the horror, nothing changed. Not really. People still had to go, still had to throw it out the window, still had to squat in the corner of a barn or lean over a trench by the river, still had to hope the next mouthful of water wouldn't kill their child. And yet they endured, because that's what we do, isn't it? We survive. We look away. We build cathedrals and carve statues and write poetry, while standing ankle-deep in waste. We whisper prayers in the dark and ignore the rats scurrying past. We light candles and pretend the shadows aren't watching. History forgets its filth, but it never truly leaves. It clings to the bricks. It hums in the foundations. It stains the very bones of a city. And if you listen, truly listen, you can still hear it. Beneath the cobblestones, beneath the stories of glory and war and kings. A quiet drip, a shovel scraping stone, a bucket tilting out a window. Somewhere in the past, the nights were the worst. When the markets fell quiet and the shouting faded. When the flicker of torchlight retreated behind shutters and the city exhaled in uneasy silence. That's when it crept in the loudest. The smell, without the noise, without the distraction of trade and bell towers and blacksmiths' hammers, you could finally smell it for what it really was. Not just the stench of waste, but of time, of suffering pressed into every inch of the town's skin. It was like the city itself was rotting from within. And yet people slept. They had to. Some lay on straw in one-room homes, families of 5 or 6 or more, sharing the same cramped space, the same air, the same coughs. The chamber pot sat in the corner, half full, humming its sour lullaby. No one wanted to empty it at night. It meant stepping outside, barefoot, onto cold cobblestone slick with rot and rat droppings. Better to wait. Better to pretend the smell wasn't there. And when it overflowed, they laid cloth over it, or didn't, because there was always something worse. Pestilence wasn't a word. They didn't need one. They just knew when something was wrong. When the baby stopped crying. When the dog wouldn't eat. When someone coughed and blood came with it. They knew without understanding. They felt it in their skin, in the stillness of water that once flowed, in the sudden hush that fell when someone didn't wake up. Sometimes entire households went quiet, and the neighbors didn't ask questions. They covered their mouths with old linen soaked in vinegar, said a prayer to saints whose names had worn thin on the tongue, and went back to sweeping their stoop. Because if they thought too hard about it, they wouldn't sleep at all. In the monasteries, scribes wrote by candlelight, quills scratching out verses of salvation, while flies circled the corners. Even holy ink couldn't hide the smell. The latrines, even those made with care and intention, leaked. The stones wept with damp, and the silence of prayer couldn't drown out the groan of pipes struggling to carry away what never truly left. In the corners of chapels behind altar cloths, rats gnawed at wood. Some monks took it as a test of faith, others left. Fled into the countryside where the wind smelled of soil instead of sin. But even there the water turned foul. Wells poisoned by distance and ignorance. Waste buried too shallow. Rain that didn't cleanse but stirred. A child drank, and within days was gone. A cow birthed still. A field lay untouched, not from drought but from fear. Because something was always underfoot. In Germany, the great cities of the Hanseatic League tried to civilize it. Regulations were posted. Latrines built, butchers fined for dumping blood into the alleys. Bakers warned not to throw yeast out with their slop. Yet behind closed doors, behind the painted shutters and tidy signs, the truth pooled. You could sweep a street. You couldn't sweep a conscience. In Paris, the Louvre was a palace of beauty. Gold leaf, marble, painted ceilings, but not a single flushing toilet. Beneath the elegance, the same stone channels ran, the same trickle of filth beneath silk slippers and candle-lit hallways. The same scent, masked by rosewater and denial. And in London, the River Thames flowed like a vein through the city's heart. Noblemen sailed it, lovers walked beside it, and night soil floated on its surface like black petals on a poisoned bloom. By the 15th century, complaints grew louder. Physicians began to understand. They didn't have the word bacteria. They didn't know about microbes, but they noticed patterns. Where filth gathered, death followed. Where water ran clear, the sick healed faster. Still, change came slow. Because change always does. A man might write a treatise on waste disposal, but a city listens only when it's drowning in its own stink. And so they kept going. Builders raised cathedrals higher. Towns expanded outward, circling themselves in ever-growing loops of wood and stone. But the waste always caught up, always seeped in through the cracks. Because you cannot build over something you refuse to remove. The people adapted. Children learned to step around slick gutters before they could speak. Mothers learned to sniff out the safe barrels of water by instinct. Fathers learned which ditches to avoid after nightfall. And all of them learned not to ask where the waste went after the cart rolled out of town, because it always came back. In the air, in the wells, in the skin. They grew used to it. That's the most haunting part. You can get used to anything, if it's all you've ever known. Even filth, even death, even the slow creeping rot that chews at wood and bone and memory. And so, under the pale hush of the moon, in the breath between one bell toll and the next, the city sighs, a soft exhale, a whisper through the alleys. And in that whisper, something ancient stirs. Not a ghost, not a god, but the memory of everything the world once tried to forget. Still here, still watching, still waiting for someone to ask what lies beneath the cobblestones. It starts with a trickle, a quiet drip in the corner of a cellar. Water, you think, until the scent reaches you. Heavy, sour, ancient. You follow it with a candle, steps careful, slow. The flame dances against the stone, and there it is. The wall weeping. Not water, something thicker. The result of decades, maybe centuries, of everything hidden being pressed down, and finally pressing back, because nothing stays buried forever. By the time the 16th century began whispering its arrival, the filth beneath Europe's cities had become something alive. Not metaphorically, literally. Maggots writhed in the cracks of stone. Rats the size of cats nested behind butcher shops. In some towns, the ground had swollen from centuries of waste, packed beneath wooden floors. Streets that were once level now rose in mounds, soft and unstable. And yet people still built on top of it, layer upon layer. A city growing not like a tree, but like a wound scabbing over again and again, without ever healing. But this was an age of vision, wasn't it? Of invention. And so came the theories. The miasma, the bad air they believed caused disease. Doctors wore bird-like masks filled with herbs, convinced that if they could just avoid the stench, they could cheat death. They were wrong, but they were close. Because that smell meant something. It meant something was rotting nearby. It meant someone had dumped a bucket too close to the well. It meant a pig carcass had been left in the gutter. It meant the plague would follow sooner or later. And when it did, it never knocked. In the village of Iam in 1665, a bundle of cloth arrived from London, infested with fleas. Within days, the tailor's assistant fell ill. Within weeks, the village was dying. But Iam did something extraordinary. They locked themselves in, chose to die inside their walls rather than spread the plague beyond them. They became their own graveyard. And as bodies were buried in the churchyard, the soil turned black with sorrow and waste. Because when death comes fast, there's no one left to clean. Elsewhere, the world moved on. In Amsterdam, canals still flowed, now darker, thicker. The golden age of trade meant spices and silks arrived daily. But so did new diseases. Sailors brought stories, merchants brought wealth, and behind them followed the same slow decay that no one ever talked about at dinner. In Rome, the Tiber glistened in the sun like a thread of gold. Pilgrims walked its bridges on their way to the Vatican. But beneath those bridges, the city's waste swirled. Offal, blood, the bloated remains of dogs, cats. Sometimes worse. The river remembered everything, even when the people did not. In Paris, the Seine glowed in moonlight, but it was poison. The city tried to ignore it. Priests threw incense in the streets. Nobles ordered flowers planted near the palaces. But no amount of perfume could hide the truth. Beneath every elegance was a festering core. And in the homes of the poor, life became a balancing act. You learned not to drink too much water, not if you couldn't be sure where it came from. You rationed rags. You reused cloth. You wiped your child's face with the cleanest part of your own shirt because there was nothing else. You boiled what you could. You prayed over what you couldn't. Sometimes the smell made you weep. Not from disgust, but from exhaustion. Because it reminded you that no matter how hard you worked, how much you scrubbed, how deeply you buried your dead, the city would never be clean. Not really. The stink lived in the walls, in your hands, in your breath. And it lived in your memory. So you stopped noticing, you stopped caring. And in the silence that followed, something inside you hardened. Not out of cruelty, but out of need. Because softness didn't survive here. Only bone, only smoke, only the slow rhythm of boots on cobblestone, sloshing through gutters that never dried. And then came the winter, bitter, long. Fires crackled in hearths, but the smoke couldn't cover the scent of mold in the walls, of damp linen, of piss frozen into the corners of the floorboards. The chamber pot cracked from the cold, the rats grew bolder, and outside, in the alley, the waste froze in great curled ribbons like dark sculptures of suffering. The city held its breath. And beneath it all, the same question pulsed. How long can a place survive like this? How many generations can grow up crawling through rot before they believe it's just life? How many children must carry the sickness in their lungs before someone finally asks, what if this isn't the way it has to be? But no one asked. Not yet, because survival is loud and change is quiet. And for now, the filth remained. Unspoken, unmoved, unburied. Waiting, patient, in the earth. The thaw came like a slow revelation. By the end of winter, the city no longer smelled like cold stone and smoke. It reeked of release. Snow melted not into clear puddles, but into gray slush steeped in months of buried rot. The gutters, clogged with straw and broken tiles, couldn't keep up. So the water pooled, mixing with waste that had frozen in place for weeks. And as the first warm wind crept down the alleys, it carried with it a scent that was old, intimate, and sickeningly familiar. The stench of life resuming. You'd hear it before you saw it. The splash of something thick hitting the ground. The scrape of a chamber pot across a wooden floor. The first dump of the season, as families cleared out the corners they'd ignored all winter. Filth piled in the alleys like unwanted guests returning for spring. Children tiptoed through the muck to find dry stones. Dogs sniffed at the puddles, tails twitching. The air was sharp with ammonia and something metallic. Blood from the butcher's barrel poured into the street and left to fester in the warming sun. And still life continued. The baker opened his shutters. The blacksmith pumped his bellows. The priest washed his hands in water fetched from a public barrel and raised them skyward. But beneath their feet, the earth was soft with waste. They all knew it. None of them spoke it. Because what could they say? This was the cost of living, not of poverty, but of survival in a world where waste was a shadow no one could escape. A place where the word clean was a luxury, a fantasy, maybe even a lie. You see, by now, people had built lives around the filth. Not out of choice, but necessity. Some even turned it into business. In Paris, there were men who bought old rags from the poor, not to clean, but to resell to papermakers. The cloth was often stiff with waste, stained beyond recognition, but still valuable, because nothing was ever truly thrown away. Everything could be repurposed, even refuse, even rot. Soap makers, too, turned to the gutters. They collected fat from butchers' scraps, bones from kitchens, ash from hearths. The city's filth became the raw ingredients of its own illusion of cleanliness, but the soap barely masked the scent. It was harsh, caustic. It burned the skin, and most couldn't afford it anyway. So they used sand, salt, vinegar, anything that scraped or stung or promised, just for a moment, to lift the stink from their skin. But it never lasted. Because the filth wasn't just outside, it was inside, in the walls, the water, the air, even in the language people used. There were no polite words for waste, no euphemisms, no embarrassment. It was too common, too essential. In taverns, people joked about it. In homes, they ignored it. In churches, they prayed for strength to endure it. The thaw came like a slow revelation. By the end of winter, the city no longer smelled like cold stone and smoke. It reeked of release. Snow melted not into clear puddles, but into gray slush steeped in months of buried rot. The gutters, clogged with straw and broken tiles, couldn't keep up. So the water pooled, mixing with waste that had frozen in place for weeks. And as the first warm wind crept down the alleys, it carried with it a scent that was old, intimate, and sickeningly familiar. The stench of life resuming. You'd hear it before you saw it. The splash of something thick hitting the ground. The scrape of a chamber pot across a wooden floor. The first dump of the season, as families cleared out the corners they'd ignored all winter. Filth piled in the alleys like unwanted guests returning for spring. Children tiptoed through the muck to find dry stones. Dogs sniffed at the puddles, tails twitching. The air was sharp with ammonia and something metallic. Blood from the butcher's barrel poured into the street and left to fester in the warming sun. And still life continued. The baker opened his shutters. The blacksmith pumped his bellows. The priest washed his hands in water fetched from a public barrel and raised them skyward. But beneath their feet, the earth was soft with waste. They all knew it. None of them spoke it. Because what could they say? This was the cost of living, not of poverty, but of survival in a world where waste was a shadow no one could escape. A place where the word clean was a luxury, a fantasy, maybe even a lie. You see, by now, people had built lives around the filth. Not out of choice, but necessity. Some even turned it into business. In Paris, there were men who bought old rags from the poor, not to clean, but to resell to papermakers. The cloth was often stiff with waste, stained beyond recognition, but still valuable, because nothing was ever truly thrown away. Everything could be repurposed, even refuse, even rot. Soap makers, too, turned to the gutters. They collected fat from butchers' scraps, bones from kitchens, ash from hearths. The city's filth became the raw ingredients of its own illusion of cleanliness. But the soap barely masked the scent. It was harsh, caustic. It burned the skin, and most couldn't afford it anyway. So they used sand, salt, vinegar, anything that scraped or stung or promised, just for a moment, to lift the stink from their skin. But it never lasted. Because the filth wasn't just outside, it was inside. In the walls, the water, the air, even in the language people used. There were no polite words for waste, no euphemisms, no embarrassment. It was too common, too essential. In taverns, people joked about it. In homes, they ignored it. In churches, they prayed for strength to endure it. There is a point in every story when silence becomes unbearable. Not because it's empty, but because it's full of things left unsaid, things buried but not forgotten. And by the early 1700s, the silence beneath Europe's streets was groaning. Cities had grown, taller, louder, more crowded. Narrow alleys once shared by horses and merchants were now choked with carts, carriages, livestock, beggars, and the relentless scrape of wheels over stone. The air was thick, not just with smoke from chimneys or the cries of fishmongers, but with something older, deeper, rising. Because by now the waste was no longer beneath the surface. It was part of it. In London, the streets glittered in the morning sun, not with dew, but with the sheen of filth. Mud that wasn't mud, water that wasn't water, horse dung layered with soot, a dozen kinds of rot baked into the cobblestones, and every night the city poured more of itself into the gutters. Blood, bones, spoiled milk, urine, ale gone sour, cloth soaked in things best not named. They called it the Great Stink. But that would come later. For now, they still pretended. A man could stand outside his shop and watch his waste swirl down the street like it belonged there. Women swept their stoops into the flow, not away from it. You could track a man's class by how high the filth clung to his boots. And beneath all this, something new was growing. Pipes, tunnels, an idea. Not yet a revolution, but a realization. What had been dismissed for centuries as unavoidable, even natural, was beginning to feel unsustainable. And so cities began to dig, not carefully, not intelligently, but with desperation. Builders laid down crude brick tunnels beneath the streets to divert rain and waste. Some connected to streams, others to rivers. Most were too small to crawl through. Many collapsed. But they were there, a network, a whisper beneath the stone. A beginning. In France, engineers in Paris drew plans, maps of sewers that might one day carry the city's darkness away. But the funding was thin, the politics worse. So they waited. And above them, the Seine grew darker. In Vienna, canals became the dumping grounds for slaughterhouses. The blood flowed in red veins between elegant bridges, past musicians and priests who chose not to look down. In Edinburgh, entire neighborhoods were built over ancient waste pits. The ground shifted in odd ways. Cellars flooded during storms. And when the wind blew just right, the truth of what lay below came back in full force. But nowhere was the rot more symbolic than in Rome. Here was the eternal city, stone stacked upon stone, century after century. Temples turned to churches, forums turned to ruins, and beneath it all, catacombs and aqueducts and latrines built by men who had understood what modern men had forgotten, that a city cannot thrive if it cannot breathe. The Romans had once built vast systems to carry water in and waste out. They had understood flow, gradient, gravity. But when their empire fell, so did that knowledge. And by the 18th century, Rome had forgotten how to clean itself. Tourists came to marvel at the Colosseum, but the air reeked of open drains. Pilgrims prayed beside puddles slick with slime. And in the shadow of marble saints, the gutters ran black. It was poetic in a way, as if history was reminding them that beauty without cleanliness is a corpse wearing perfume. And then came the flood. Not literal at first, but of death. In Naples, a cholera outbreak swept through the city in 1720. It started in the poor districts, where water was fetched from wells dug too close to cesspits. Children fell first, then mothers, then anyone who touched the same door handle. drank from the same pail, shared the same rags. It spread like fire, and when the priests died too, the city stopped pretending it was divine punishment. It was something else, something they had made. London followed. In 1750, its death rate soared, not from plague, but from the 1,000 unnamed sicknesses that came from drinking what shouldn't be drunk. And still the Thames flowed on, wide and brown and full of secrets. The people of the city began to whisper, "What's in the water?" They had asked before, but this time they listened. Some proposed boiling. Others suggested burying all latrines outside the walls. Still others whispered a radical thought. What if every house had a pipe? What if waste could be carried away before it became sickness? But that required planning, money, time, and no one wanted to pay for what they didn't want to see. So the cartmen still came at dawn. Their wheels groaned, their boots splashed, their backs bent under the weight of barrels filled with the collective shame of thousands. They dumped it outside the city, into trenches or fields or rivers, and turned their carts back around. Because it would never stop, not until the system changed. And the system, for now, was still denial. But below the surface, the tunnels grew, wider, deeper. Cities, without even realizing it, were preparing for something. Not out of hope, not even out of cleanliness, but because there was no more room to pretend. The filth was rising, and history, once content to whisper, was beginning to shout. By the turn of the 19th century, the lie had worn thin. The perfume no longer masked the rot. The prayers no longer held back the sickness. The filth that had always lived quietly beneath the surface now surged into the open, bold and undeniable. The streets of Europe's greatest cities, London, Paris, Berlin, reeked not of empire or elegance but of decay. Generations had built their lives on top of centuries of waste, and now the ground was rebelling. You could smell it in the morning air, hear it in the coughs of children, see it in the bloated bodies pulled from rivers that had once been sacred, now turned to flowing graveyards. In London, the Thames was dying. It hadn't always been this way. There had been times, distant, half-remembered, when the river was a place of baptism and song, a ribbon of silver through the heart of a mighty city. But now, it was a sewer with a current, a living broth of human waste, rotting meat, dead animals, and industrial runoff. By 1858, the stench became unbearable. Not metaphorically, literally. They called it the Great Stink, and for once the rich couldn't ignore it. The smell seeped through the windows of Parliament. Curtains soaked in vinegar failed to block it. Lords vomited behind their benches. Debates halted. Sessions suspended. The river, that ancient artery, had turned against them. It was poetic justice, maybe, because for centuries they had let it carry away everything they didn't want to see. Poverty, disease, waste, corpses. Now it had brought them back. Joseph Bazalgette was not a poet. He was an engineer. Quiet, methodical, brilliant, and perhaps the first man in generations to understand that a city was only as healthy as the water that flowed through it. He saw what others had ignored. The city's waste wasn't just a symptom, it was the cause of sickness, of death, of decay. And so he began to design. Miles of brick-lined tunnels beneath London, arteries to carry away the filth, pumps to move it, gates to control it, outfalls to deposit it far enough downstream that the city might finally breathe again. It would take years, fortunes, and faith, because to build a sewer is to admit you were drowning all along. But he did it, and slowly, so slowly the river changed. It stopped bubbling in the summer heat. It stopped killing those who dared to drink from it. It began to flow like water again, not blood, not sickness, just water. People noticed. Other cities followed. Paris hired housemen. New boulevards were cut through ancient neighborhoods, wide and orderly and lined with pipes. The air grew cleaner. The death rates dropped. In Berlin, sewage was redirected to distant fields. In New York, engineers studied London's blueprints, began carving their own solutions beneath Manhattan's feet. It was not perfect, not fast, and not fair, because the poor still suffered first and worst. The rich still closed their windows and claimed ignorance. And many cities, most cities, resisted change until the corpses piled too high. But something had shifted. For the first time in history, humans began to build not just for the living, but for the waste they produced. They began to understand that what we flush away does not disappear. It simply waits, somewhere, downstream. And they began finally to respect that truth. Doctors now washed their hands. Factories were forced to treat their runoff. Waste collectors became civil servants, not pariahs. The city began to breathe again, not clean but cleaner, not healed but healing. And beneath it all, the great sewers ran. Vast, echoing cathedrals of brick and water, sacred in their own way, not places of worship, but of reckoning. Because every drop that flowed through them was a reminder of the centuries spent pretending waste didn't matter. Every tunnel whispered of the dead, of children lost to cholera, of mothers who drank from poisoned wells, of fathers who carried their loved ones through gutters in silence. And the whispers said, never again. It was not the end of filth. It never would be. But it was the beginning of memory, of accountability, of a future that no longer forgot the past every time it flushed. And as cities rose higher into the sky, glass towers, steel bridges, glowing lights, the tunnels below remained, forgotten by most, essential to all. Because beneath every miracle of civilization, there runs a river of everything we try to leave behind. And if we ever stop listening to it, it will rise again. And slowly, so slowly the river changed. It stopped bubbling in the summer heat. It stopped killing those who dared to drink from it. It began to flow like water again, not blood, not sickness, just water. People noticed. Other cities followed. Paris hired housemen. New boulevards were cut through ancient neighborhoods, wide and orderly and lined with pipes. The air grew cleaner. The death rates dropped. In Berlin, sewage was redirected to distant fields. In New York, engineers studied London's blueprints, began carving their own solutions beneath Manhattan's feet. It was not perfect, not fast, and not fair, because the poor still suffered first and worst. The rich still closed their windows and claimed ignorance. And many cities, most cities, resisted change until the corpses piled too high. But something had shifted. For the first time in history, humans began to build not just for the living, but for the waste they produced. They began to understand that what we flush away does not disappear. It simply waits, somewhere, downstream. And they began finally to respect that truth. Doctors now washed their hands. Factories were forced to treat their runoff. Waste collectors became civil servants, not pariahs. The city began to breathe again, not clean but cleaner, not healed but healing. And beneath it all, the great sewers ran. Vast, echoing cathedrals of brick and water, sacred in their own way, not places of worship, but of reckoning. Because every drop that flowed through them was a reminder of the centuries spent pretending waste didn't matter. Every tunnel whispered of the dead, of children lost to cholera, of mothers who drank from poisoned wells, of fathers who carried their loved ones through gutters in silence. And the whispers said, never again. It was not the end of filth. It never would be. But it was the beginning of memory, of accountability, of a future that no longer forgot the past every time it flushed. And as cities rose higher into the sky, glass towers, steel bridges, glowing lights, the tunnels below remained, forgotten by most, essential to all. Because beneath every miracle of civilization, there runs a river of everything we try to leave behind. And if we ever stop listening to it, it will rise again. In Lagos, the story is similar. Explosive population growth, fragile infrastructure. People build where they can, sleep where there is space, dig holes where the city has failed them. Septic tanks leak. Waste runs down hillsides. The air hums with methane. And beneath it all, always the same question. Why hasn't it changed? It's easy to blame poverty, but the truth is more uncomfortable. We, all of us, chose to stop looking. Modern life makes waste invisible. We flush and it's gone. We wash and it disappears. But that vanishing act is an illusion built on billions of dollars of pipe, brick, labor, and blind faith. Because behind the curtain, the waste never truly leaves. It collects, it seeps, it returns. In the Pacific, a floating island of plastic waste stretches thousands of miles. Garbage flushed, dumped, blown into storm drains and rivers, and carried out to sea. It swirls and gyres, chokes fish, washes up on beaches. Proof that waste doesn't just vanish, it migrates. And the microplastics, they come back. In the water, in the food, in the air. We have found traces of human waste on the tallest peaks, in the deepest trenches, even in Arctic ice. Fecal bacteria on escalator rails. Urine traces on every subway seat. Trillions of microbial fragments in the rain. We have become a civilization suspended in its own residue. But here's the haunting truth. The sewers were never just about waste. They were a mirror. They show us who we are. Not just in how we dispose of what we don't want, but in what we refuse to confront. In how we bury guilt. In how we sanitize suffering. In how we build shining cities on forgotten graves. Because behind every flush, every drain, every hidden tunnel is history. The poor who died in filth, the laborers who dug with bare hands through rivers of rot, the women who miscarried from contaminated water, the children whose coughs became graves, the cities who rose and fell and rose again, always atop their own excrement. And we call this progress. But progress doesn't mean escape. It means inheritance. And the inheritance is clear. We are a species that lives with waste on it, in it, as part of it. And maybe, if we ever truly looked, not just into the pipes, but into ourselves, we would see that sanitation is not just a human right, but a human reckoning. Because what we throw away always comes back, sometimes in floods, sometimes in fire, sometimes in silence, waiting underground like a memory we buried too deep and forgot to mourn. Beneath every great civilization runs a secret river. It does not glisten in the sun. It does not sing with poetry or echo with the speeches of kings. It groans. It bubbles. It remembers. And long after empires fall and monuments crumble, this river remains. It is the river of waste, and it is the most honest thing we have ever built. In this final chapter of our descent into the forgotten underworld of history, we return not to the streets, but to the soul of the city, the place where all things hidden are kept alive, if not by memory, then by function. The sewer is not merely an invention of necessity. It is an archive of everything we hoped to bury, every shame, every silence, every story. And now, in our age of steel and screens and satellites, the river still flows. It flows through underground labyrinths beneath Tokyo, where engineers in boots the size of coffins wade through storms. The metropolitan area outer underground discharge channel, yes, that's its real name, stands like a modern-day cathedral, with vast concrete shafts rising into darkness, built to stop floods, to save lives, to manage waste. But at its heart, it is the same old truth. We still haven't found a better way to deal with what we don't want to see. In Los Angeles, the Hyperion wastewater treatment plant processes hundreds of millions of gallons a day. A city of stars, built atop rivers of darkness. Beneath the beach sunsets and rooftop parties, the plant rumbles like a giant stomach, digesting what the city flushes away. In Seoul, Seoul's Cheonggyecheon stream once carried raw sewage through the heart of the city. Today it's a revitalized urban park, clean, shimmering, beautiful. But it only looks that way because the filth has been hidden, redirected, managed. The stream is artificial now, filtered, controlled, manufactured cleanliness. Because we have not eliminated the waste. We've only gotten better at hiding it, and still we search for purity. Still we scrub and sanitize and filter and brand everything clean while forgetting what it cost. The labor, the blood, the centuries of rot that taught us the price of ignorance. Even now, nearly 2 billion people around the world live without basic sanitation, in refugee camps, in informal settlements, in places where waste still trickles through the dirt beside a child's foot, where clean water is a miracle, not a right, where cholera still waits like a wolf at the edge of every drought. We cannot tell the story of progress without telling the story of filth, because they are the same story. The flush toilet, hailed as a symbol of modern life, is a marvel only because it whispers a lie we want to believe, that we are better now, cleaner, more civilized. But that porcelain bowl still drains into a tunnel. That tunnel still carries what we discard. And if we ever stop caring where it goes, we start the story over. That's the danger. Because history doesn't repeat like a song. It seeps like water through cracked stone, like the slow return of a stench you thought you'd buried for good. And so we have to remember the plague carts rolling at dawn, the gutters flowing with offal and wine and blood, the silent houses with no one left inside, the rats, the flies, the screams muffled behind cloth masks, soaked in lavender and prayer. And we must ask ourselves, not with fear, but with clarity, what we still choose to ignore today. Because filth has always thrived in our silences, in our blindness, and if we don't keep looking, it will rise again. So the next time you turn on a tap, flush a toilet, walk across a city street, pause, just for a second. Think about what flows beneath you, and not just the pipes. Think of the people, the past, the price paid so your waste can vanish with a whisper. And remember, it doesn't vanish. It travels. It waits. It teaches. That's the real story. Not of sewers, but of us. Because the history of waste is the history of humanity. Unfiltered, unforgiving, unforgettable. Thank you for walking through the shadows with me tonight. If this story made you pause, or gave you a new way to see the world beneath your feet, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear where you're watching from, and if you're still awake, still here in the quiet with me. Maybe dim the lights a little lower, take a deep breath, and sit with the silence. It remembers more than we think. Subscribe if you haven't already. There are more stories like this, stories most people don't dare tell. Until next time, stay curious. And don't forget what's beneath you.